I say it again. All right. And then I can say it. Then I can say it quieter. You can still hear me perfectly. Sorry. I've always secretly wanted to be a teacher, and I never trained to be one. So you're my class right now. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the first part of this morning. Sorry. And I am very excited that now we can be here as a whole group and listen to Karlos talk about his work in Tulsa. I've sent around the papers that he wrote. Some of you might have read them. Some of you did not get the chance to. He will also quickly introduce himself. Yeah, I think your work is great. I'm really happy to hear you talk about it, and we will have enough time to also get in a conversation after his presentation. So yeah, I hope that we will have a inspirational exchange and we can learn from each other. And so with that, I will give the word to you, Karlos. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope this has been as wonderful an experience for you as it has been for me. I've been here since Wednesday with Widen the Circle and Facing History on a study trip that is really changing my life as we speak. So thank you for being here. Thank you for bearing witness with us as we learn about what I call the felt history, or I would call the felt history of the Holocaust. Thank you for embracing us and allowing us in to understand from your vantage point, from your perspective, why this history matters so much. So I just want to start with thank you. And I also want to thank the leadership of Widen the Circle for pulling together this massive trip that I know took months to plan. So thank you, Joel. Thank you. I don't know where Rebecca is, but thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, all of the team, and certainly Facing History, Mark, for all the support that I know that you provided for the trip. So I'm just in a place of gratitude. So I always have to start with thank you. Now let's talk about Tulsa and my work in Tulsa. But my grandmother used to always tell me before you start talking to anyone, and she was really worried about me talking to strangers. And she would always say, tell the people who you are before you start talking to them. Tell the people who you are before you start talking to them. So I'm gonna, in love for my grandmother, I'm gonna tell you who I am before I talk to you. But I'm obviously a professor. I'm an American professor. I teach at the University of Oklahoma. I didn't bring a map, but if you think about the United States, Oklahoma is in the middle of the country. And OU is in the middle of Oklahoma. That's what Oklahomans say. Or that's what people who go to OU say. So we're at the center of it all, is kind of the idea. But I teach at the University of Oklahoma the most difficult history in Oklahoma. And that most difficult history is the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Before I tell you about my engagement with that history and the memory work around that history, I just want to help you to understand how I got on this path in the first place. I used to talk about myself as just, if you could take this off, I used to talk about myself as a historian of African American history. And that was realistically what I was. I wrote books and articles for other historians. That's what I did, right? And I taught classes for students and undergraduate courses, graduate courses. I trained other historians. That was my work, and I really enjoyed that work until I realized I was doing it wrong. And I was talking to my dear brother, Derek Black, in the back of the room during the previous presentation, and he asked me, how did I begin to do the kind of work that I was doing? And I told him the story of how I visited the Peace and Justice Memorial the Peace and Justice Memorial is a memorial to victims, all victims of American lynching, especially Black victims of American lynching. And it's in Montgomery, Alabama, in the American South. And I went there right after it opened, and I told Derek that I was unprepared to actually visit the Peace and Justice Memorial because I was going there in a transactional mode. I was just going there because a reporter had asked me to give them comment. And that's the only reason I was really going when I was going. And so I get on a plane, I go to the Peace and Justice Memorial, not prepared, not processing what I'm about to experience. And I go into the Peace and Justice Memorial. And as I walk into the Peace and Justice Memorial, I begin to see names of individuals that I had studied for many years. And it's starting to dawn on me as I walk through the memorial, and I'm looking as I walk deeper in, I'm starting to imagine the victims that I've studied because I'm seeing their names on these still posts that are representative of lynching in this memorial. And it's then that I realized that I've never mourned the individuals that had been brutally killed by lynch mobs. I realized that I had never mourned, taken the time to even have the thought to know to mourn them, because I had always thought about them as academic subjects to be studied, to be dissected, to be talked about with other historians. And that chilling realization just knocked me over. And I said, I can't do this work anymore that way without recognizing the deep humanity of the people that I study. And so that powerful experience made me add community engaged to what I do, because it was no longer okay for me to just study the history. I had to care about the people impacted, affected about the history today. And so that's where the community engaged history comes from, and that's where all of my energy, right, for the memory work comes from, is bearing witness to those victims, survivors, and descendants of American lynching. That's the work that I do. I don't teach anymore. I bear witness to the victims, survivors, and descendants of American lynching. That's who I am, bear witness. And so I've written extensively about lynching. My first book, Beyond the Rope, tried to help Black studies complicate their understanding relationship to the Black experience of lynching. In the murder of Emmett Till, I tried to understand how could American society in the 1950s kill or murder a 14-year-old boy and never ever received, the family never received justice. And most recently, and what I want to talk to you today about, is my work in Tulsa, Oklahoma, around the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. I could tell you so much. I could tell you so much about Greenwood, popularly known as Black Wall Street. I can tell you so much about this history. I can tell you so much about the work that the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, which was the organizing body for all the commemorative activities around the race massacre. I had the great honor and privilege to serve on the steering committee, a smaller group of about 12 people who really oversaw everything that was happening in terms of the commemoration. And as a part of being on the steering committee, I led up the educational initiatives of the Centennial Commission. And so what you see here is Hannibal Johnson, who was the chair of the committee, the education committee. I'm somewhere in the back, but he is giving a discussion to teachers. These are Tulsa teachers. He's having a conversation with teachers about the history of the Greenwood district, the area in which the majority of black residents live prior to the race massacre. And so the main work that I did, and I would say memory work that I did in Tulsa, revolved around working with teachers. And the reason why I worked with teachers is because in Oklahoma, the Tulsa race massacre had not been taught for 100 years. So we're 100 years later, since 1921. And in 100 years, the race massacre had not been taught in the state of Oklahoma. Even in the textbooks of Oklahoma history, there may have been a small mention, maybe a paragraph, on what actually happened. And so for 100 years, the race massacre isn't taught. And for 100 years, myths about what occurred or didn't occur were able to spread. Lies and deceit about what occurred were able to fester. And all the while, the real story of what happened, the story told from victims, survivors, and from survivors and descendants, that story, because it hadn't been taught, that story, right, was clouded, right? And in many ways, people simply didn't know it, right? And so a big part of the work that the commission and particularly the institutes was developing curriculum and teaching resources, right? Giving teachers the tools, right? The tools necessary to teach the race massacre at a high level and in a way that we hadn't done for 100 years. And it wasn't good enough for us to just teach it. We had to teach it correctly. We had to teach it in a way that would actually do good and not do harm. And so in order for it to make sure we didn't do harm, we had to center equity, we had to center inclusion, we had to center, and this is the most important piece, reconciliation. Because in Oklahoma, as I mentioned before, this is a really explosive history. Oklahomans do not want to talk about the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. One, because it's so painful for the black community. Two, because it's so shameful for the white community. And three, there is still justice work to be done. And those three things, Oklahomans don't want to talk about. And so doing a teaching institute in that environment, we really had to emphasize reconciliation because we did not want to scare people. We wanted people to understand that the point of having difficult conversations is so that you can have a healing relationship. The point is not to just have hard conversations, it's to get to a better conversation, a healing conversation. And so focusing on reconciliation instead of hard history that frightens people in Oklahoma. It actually frightens Americans, actually. But the point is, we focused on reconciliation, and in doing so, we created a space, a safe space, a space where teachers felt comfortable entering, because what they got from it were tools to have a really inclusive conversation in their classroom. And so much of my work with teachers, which was working with them to help them to understand it's great that you're excited about teaching this history, but you have to teach it in a way that does good and not harm. We have to teach, and when I say do good versus harm, ultimately what I was beginning to say to teachers is in the telling of this history, we have to do something that hasn't been done for 100 years. What we haven't done for 100 years is center victims, survivors, and descendants in the telling of this history. If we can do that 100 years later, if we can center victims, survivors, and descendants 100 years later, something that we haven't done in this state, we haven't done in this nation, if we can do that today, if we can do that in 2021, 100 years later, then maybe we can get to the justice work that we absolutely need to do. If we can find the strength to center victims and survivors that we've never done, maybe we can also find the strength to do the justice work connected to centering them. And so what I faced in the Institute right away and trying to center them was, how should we talk about the race massacre? Should we talk about it as a race riot as it had been talked about for 100 years? Or do we call it what it really was and what survivors called it at the time, a massacre? And so you can imagine all the emotions that got people riled up, I'm gonna say. That got people riled up. That got people mad. Because for 100 years we had said it was a riot, that the white community was not at fault. It was a riot. Riots happen, right? And they're spontaneous. And a riot can happen anywhere. So you can't blame anyone. And if you're gonna blame someone, it was the black community's fault. That is what was invested in this term riot. It wasn't the white community's fault. It was the black community's fault. And when you start saying, we shouldn't talk about it as a riot, well, what should we say? Well, it was a massacre. The community, the survivors, has talked about it as a massacre for 100 years. And in calling it a massacre, what they're conjuring up, or trying to conjure up, is that this was the deadliest attack on a black community in American history. And I know that because I'm a historian of lynching and I've studied this. I know there were 250 different attacks on black communities across about 150 years of American history. And in Tulsa, a black community, about 30 block area was destroyed, completely destroyed, in less than 24 hours. Everything. 1,200 homes, 200 businesses, a population of 11,000 people rendered homeless. Bearing witness to that means talking about this as a massacre. Bearing witness to that means talking about the complicity of white citizens and the city in the destruction, the rapid destruction of Greenwood. Black Wall Street, one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, black community per capita in the United States in 1921. And so when Tulsa is destroyed in less than 24 hours, it's not just the community that's being destroyed. It was the idea that a black community such as Tulsa could exist. And that's why, again, the term massacre is more appropriate than riot, right? Riot is the term of, it's not my fault, we were not complicit. In the state of Oklahoma, many who have a difficult time with embracing, accepting that even if 100 years ago, all the things that's invested in this term are true, the community of Greenwood today stands ready to have a healing relationship. And part of what this Race Massacre Institute that we did from 2018 to 2021, it was about helping to mobilize the community through teachers and ultimately students to begin to change the sentiments that it's not our fault, right? And that if we get invested in massacre, it's not saying it's your fault, it's saying that it's a healing relationship is possible. That was the deep work that we were, alongside the memory work that we were striving to do. I'm gonna speed through, I spent too much time on talking about the Institute. I'm gonna kind of glide through the Greenwood Rising. I was involved with Greenwood Rising, this state-of-the-art history center that tells the story for the first time tells the story for the world, the story of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And so Greenwood Rising is a very painful topic for me, even though I wasn't as involved in it as some of my colleagues. I helped with the name. If you're curious, I would take credit. No, sorry. I was a part of the conversations about what would be an appropriate name for this unprecedented, state-of-the-art history center that would tell the story of the massacre. The reason why it was important for me to sort of at least touch upon it is the most important work for me became getting really proximate with victims, survivors, and descendants. And that took me to writing a book, a photographic history on the race massacre. But probably the most important work besides the Institute and writing the book was supporting the Greenwood Rising, because it had been the vision of survivors, right? And ultimately descendants to one day have a facility, a world-class facility, not just books and articles, newspaper accounts, but an actual state-of-the-art facility akin to a Smithsonian-style facility that could tell this precious, sacred story of this community. And so Greenwood Rising, for me, is the manifestation of a dream that survivors had that we were able to bring to fruition. But that doesn't mean everyone thinks that way or should even think that way. And so why it's so painful for me to talk about this is there are, dare say, descendants as well as survivors who would say that Greenwood Rising is a perversion of the memory of survivors. It does not represent the community. They would say that until it becomes a community institution, they will not support it, right? And so for someone who has my sense of self and purpose and belief, my life and my work, my witness is about bearing witness to victims, survivors, and descendants of American lynching. To have done so much work to make that happen for the community that I hope to represent to feel that way is really dispiriting. And so this work, even when you think you're doing it well, you may not do it as well as you need to do it, right? And so I was telling Mark this, a big part of my journey in doing remembrance work is remembering to be really humble and remembering to be really vulnerable and remembering to not just be vulnerable in private, but to learn how to be vulnerable with dignity, integrity in public, which is the hardest thing to do. But this kind of work requires it, because you will have situations like this where you can work and work and work and believe that you are doing the right thing. You're working with people in the community that think you're doing the right thing, representing victims, representing survivors, representing descendants as we think they might want to. But to have that, to say someone within the community say, no, that is not what this represents. This is the antithesis of what the survivors, what descendants want. And sitting with that, holding that, right, is a lot of what the hard work, I would say, of doing memory work. And so I was having just a great conversation with Carlin about just how much doing this work has made me confront the work that one has to do just to do the work of keeping alive, breathing life into memories that we want to center in the present, right? The work that it requires for us to do that is often very spiritual, right? And I've had to really get in touch with that so that I can continue to bear witness to victims, survivors, descendants of American lynching, because the work can get really hard. It's not just the opposition. Sometimes for for doing this work. It's the very members of the community that you're supporting where the hardest sort of revelations can come from. And so for me, Tulsa has really taught me that. Okay, thank you so much. I'm just gonna kind of close with just sort of talking about the National Day of Learning that the commission sponsored that I led up, because it kind of touches on kind of why I'm here today. You know, the work in Oklahoma, focusing in on what Oklahoma needs were really important, because as I mentioned, in Oklahoma, for 100 years, this history had not been taught. And so initially the commission's role and goal was to stimulate teaching and scholarship within Oklahoma. But ultimately, as that work matured and we got closer to 2021, when we knew, we predicted, and we were right, the world would care about what had happened in Tulsa, it was going to be really important for us to try to create an educational opportunity for those who were interested, an audience of the willing. And so what we did was create a National Day of Learning. A National Day of Learning that became an International Day of Learning. And the goal was to try to help others from around the world who may have never heard of Tulsa, may have never heard of Greenwood or Black Wall Street, to help them connect with the story of the race massacre, perhaps in a more universal way. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we communicate a story that maybe some people know, maybe others know really a lot, but how can we create a meaningful memorable experience? And so what we ultimately came up with was, let's make sure we center victims, survivors, and descendants. And what that meant was we had a forum where we invited in descendants, we invited in actually survivors as well, to share their understanding with teachers, dignitaries, the massacre, and through then having sessions around those conversations, we could hope to get to the healing, right, from these difficult conversations. And so a lot of my work ultimately, both in terms of how I negotiated and then the work that I'm trying to do with communities, ends up being about healing, because I think, and what I've learned working with my co-collaborator, Tamara Labak, who's a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, is that our relationship with the past is always going to be imperfect. Our relationship with the present is imperfect. Our relationship with the past is always going to be imperfect. So the best thing that we can have, the best kind of relationship that we can have with the past is a healing relationship with the past, right? And I'm gonna, in a very cinematic way, pause right there. And my dear brother, Christopher, where are you, Christopher?
Right.
We're gonna have a conversation. We're gonna talk about what a healing relationship is. Oh, there you go. I'm sorry, I didn't see you. We're gonna have a conversation about healing relationships, as well as other things. So thank you guys for your rapt attention. I really felt your attention. Thank you so much, but we're gonna transition to having a broader conversation about the memory work that I've done in Tulsa and the great work that Christopher has done with his students. So, but thank you for your attention. I really, really appreciate it.
I just have one thing to say. So from now on, we will translate consecutively. I think because so when you speak, please leave enough time for me to do the translation in any direction. Genau, ich kann es auch nicht. Genau. Vielen Dank, Friederike. Du musst jetzt dann los, aber vielen Dank
It was my pleasure. It was a great pleasure to listen to very interesting and moving accounts, witnesses, testimonials. Thank you very much. It was a privilege to be here with you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and so we will start with this little conversation between Christoph and Karlos, because we figured that with so many people it's really hard to have a conversation among all of us. We will open it up to the whole group, but we will first have this conversation so that we can even have more inspiration, and then it's also your turn. Also wir fangen jetzt an mit einer kleinen Unterhaltung zwischen den beiden, weil es ist in so einer großen Gruppe manchmal schwierig, dann direkt in eine Unterhaltung mit allen zu kommen. Und danach geht es dann aber auch an euch weiter, und dann könnt ihr auch eure Beiträge gestalten.
So my name is Christoph Pies. I was born in the same year as Israel was founded. So then the students always thought, oh, which year? As long as I didn't ask, what did you do in the Ice Age? I was content then. So, but that really happened. So
Also Christoph Pies ist Lehrer, und er ist im gleichen Jahr geboren, in dem Israel gegründet wurde, und dann fragen die Schüler immer, welches Jahr war das? Und er ist aber glücklich, wenn sie ihn nicht fragen, was er in der Eiszeit gemacht hat, aber auch das ist schon passiert.
So I did not have such a smart grandmother like you. I didn't know my grandparents because of the war. So they died because of the consequences of the war. So I never had experienced my grandparents.
Er hatte nicht so eine kluge Großmutter, die ja Karlos gesagt hat, dass er sich immer erstmal vorstellen soll, bevor er mit Leuten spricht. Christoph kannte seine Großeltern nicht, die sind aus den Folgen des Kriegs gestorben. Also er hatte Großeltern.
But let's come to the topic you are talking about. So I could apply that for 95% to the situation I was in when I started researching the Jewish life in our region.
Also jetzt zum Thema. Tatsächlich kann Christoph 95% von dem, was Karlos gerade erzählt hat, auf seine eigene Arbeit beziehen. Vor 30.
So it started 40 years ago as a young teacher. I was very optimistic as a historian. I studied history in Bonn. I worked at university, wrote books for schools at a big publishing firm in Stuttgart, you all know. And then I came to school, and I made an association and a club in school, and we tried to follow the Jewish traces in our region.
Okay, also er hat vor 40 Jahren angefangen, Geschichte zu studieren, und war als Lehrer und war sehr optimistisch und war an der Uni und hat angefangen, irgendwie Forschung zu betreiben, und ist dann an die Schule gekommen und hat dort eine Arbeitsgruppe gegründet, die die jüdische Geschichte in dem Ort, sich zur Aufgabe gemacht hat, die jüdische Geschichte im Ort zu erforschen.
Now we had an address from a Holocaust survivor who survived Auschwitz in the United States. Later we invited him and the whole family, and he wrote us a letter with many addresses all over the world. And then one letter, a very long letter from Israel, came back to us, and the whole family Forst, a typical German name. They also had the Christian names like Werner, Rolf, and Siegfried, and so on. You can imagine what that meant. And they described what was going on until 1942.
Sie hatten eine Adresse von einem Überlebenden, von einem Zeitzeugen, und haben den angeschrieben und haben von ihm wieder mehrere Adressen gefunden und haben die dann kontaktiert und haben dann Briefe zurückbekommen, besonders einen langen Brief aus Israel, in dem die Zeitzeugen ihre Geschichte bis 1942 erzählt haben.
Now then I sent my students to the administration of the town, today 5,000 people, to the mayor and his staff, and they said the Jews were all rich, they could escape early enough.
Dann hat er seine Schüler zum Rathaus zum Rathaus geschickt, um nachzuforschen, was da mit den Familien sozusagen passiert ist. Und da kam die Antwort, ja, die Juden hier hatten alle so viel Geld, die konnten rechtzeitig abhauen.
Okay, but at that time we fortunately knew that it was not true. And that is the beginning of my work, which resembles to what Karlos has done.
Ja,
Now-
und das, genau, und es war aber ihnen da eben Gott sei Dank schon klar, dass das so nicht stimmt. Und das ist sozusagen der Beginn dieser Arbeit, die eben jetzt der Arbeit von Karlos in Tulsa auch ähnelt.
Now, then we started to go into archives. So I was in the city council and I had access and I had key to the cellar. And there was the communal archive. And then I bought a copy machine, went into the cellar, of course, completely illegally, so don't tell it anybody. So, and then I copied thousands of pages, and that was the basis for our historical research.
Ja.
So otherwise, it would not have happened
Yeah.
if I hadn't
In a
behaved
disposition.
illegally.
Okay, also er war Mitglied des Stadtrats und hatte daher Zugang zu den Archiven und zum Keller. Er hatte zwar den Zugang, aber er durfte das eigentlich nicht machen, was er dann gemacht hat. Er ist nämlich in die Keller gegangen, hat sich einen Kopierer gekauft, hat ihn da mitgenommen und hat tausende von Seiten kopiert aus dem Archiv. Das durfte aber keiner wissen und erzählt es niemandem, der ihm jetzt noch im Nachgang dafür belangt wird.
But that was the basis as a historian, as a rational thinking historian, and it ended up in a very emotional human mankind. That's what you said.
Und das ist genau der Punkt. Er hat auch einfach als nüchterner Historiker in der Uni mit diesem so angefangen und aufgehört hat es aber mit diesem emotionalen, ja, mit der Emotionalität, mit der man dann an diese Geschichte irgendwie rangeht.
Also, and that has lasted now more than 40 years. Now let's come. We should make a conversation.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
So what was your beginning of this work concerning the documents, the archive, the access to the archive? You as being a member of the Black community, can you describe the obstacles you had?
Die Frage ist jetzt, wie war der Anfang der Arbeit bei Karlos, also wirklich diese Recherchearbeit, die Forschungsarbeit, er als Teil der schwarzen Community, was gab es da irgendwelche Hindernisse?
There were many obstacles, but the principal obstacle was that I was not a member of the Black community of Greenwood. And by not being a member of that community, I was going to have to build trust to represent that community's story.
Okay. Es gab viele Hindernisse. Das größte war, dass er nicht Mitglied eben der schwarzen Community in Greenwood war. Und das allererste, was er machen musste, war Vertrauen aufzubauen.
And so, as an outsider, my principal obstacle was trust. Getting the community to trust me, to embrace me, to tell the story. And that's where humility, that's where the vulnerability really comes in.
Genau, also er musste dieses Vertrauen in der Community erstmal gewinnen und das ist eben das, wo seine Demut oder seine und auch die Verletzbarkeit herkommt, die er in seiner Arbeit eben beschreibt.
The trust was so important because, again, this is a community that had been destroyed, had never received reparations, victims' stories discounted, outsiders have come and gone, and nothing has changed. And so their level of suspicion is high and their level of trust low.
Und diese Community in Greenwood ist eine, die nie Entschädigung für das bekommen hat, was ihnen angetan wurde, die ja teilweise, wo die Geschichte angezweifelt wurde, wo Leute von draußen kommen und gehen und deswegen war das Niveau an Misstrauen hoch und das Niveau an Vertrauen sehr niedrig.
But now, 6 years later, I'm a trusted member of the community. I can be in Berlin and I can talk about victims, survivors, and descendants and know that what I say is rooted in the relationships of the place. And so I'm in a trusted place. Now I can represent the community because I'm a part of the community, and that wasn't the case when I started.
Und jetzt sechs Jahre später ist er wirklich anerkannt und er hat dieses Vertrauen und er weiß, dass wenn er mit den Betroffenen spricht, dass das ein Ort des Vertrauens und der Offenheit miteinander ist. Und er ist jetzt Teil von ihnen und kann das auch präsentieren nach außen.
For me, the key word was not trust, because I was a trusted teacher in Germany, in the country. The people, she's laughing, they trust the teachers at that time. The students trusted me, the parents trusted me. I was a reputed member of the community. I had different functions in the cultural association and in the city council. For me, the key word was the truth. It was very
Also bei Christoph war das Problem gar nicht so sehr das Vertrauen, weil als Lehrer, zumindest in der Zeit, wurde man geachtet und hatte ein großes Vertrauen genossen, sowohl in der Gemeinschaft, bei den Eltern, bei den SchülerInnen. Er war Teil des Stadtrats, er hatte einen Verein gegründet. Also für ihn ist das Schlüsselwort nicht Vertrauen, sondern Wahrheit.
So that is why we started in the archives. And we invited then all the Holocaust survivors. At that time they were younger than I am now, so 60 or 70, and they came from all parts of the world into the school. And we made a project week and we published a book about it, but nobody wanted to buy it. Because they told them the stories they had experienced either in many concentration camps or in Castellan in their hometown. We made class reunions of their former classmates. They came, and that is a very nice expression of you, the healing reconciliation. So, and that worked, and we worked for 1 week with 25 or 27 people from all over the world with 1,000 students, 1 week, and that was the turning point in my life.
Okay, that was a lot. Also, ihr habt dann diese Recherchearbeit gemacht, ihr habt Bücher geschrieben. Wer wollte diese Bücher nicht kaufen? Keiner wollte diese Bücher kaufen. Also sie haben dann diese Recherchearbeit gemacht, das runtergeschrieben, gedruckt, veröffentlicht und keiner wollte es kaufen. Aber sie haben vor allem auch diese Arbeit mit den Nachfahren und mit den Zeitzeugen gemacht und haben teilweise Klassentreffen organisiert, wo die Zeitzeugen dann wieder nach Castellan kamen. Und das habt ihr zusammen mit 1000 Schülern
mit 1000 Schülern
organisiert,
und 27 Überlebenden.
Genau.
Okay, but now back to you. Yes.
Well, I just want to emphasize something you said, which is you were trusted by the community. You were a reputed member of the community. And I think a part of it is not just you were a trusted scholar, but that you were in service to this community, right? This community, this remembrance community. And that's where the trust was as well. It wasn't just the expertise. And in Tulsa, the trust was built on being in service to the community. That's where the trust, so me showing up to community events, me caring about not just the history, but the people today connected to the history. And that's where the trust is. And so, but it's cemented by living in service to the survivors, the descendants, and so forth. So I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't just your expertise, but it's also the service that you've done. I mean, the week-long, guided research project that you led. That was where the trust is too. But
Sorry, Karlos, I need to.
I'm so sorry. I keep forgetting. I'm sorry, Lily.
It's totally fine. Karlos hebt nur noch mal hervor, dass das Vertrauen, das Christoph hatte, wahrscheinlich ja nicht nur daran lag, dass Christoph diesen Status hatte, sondern vor allem, dass Christoph Teil dieser Community war, beziehungsweise Karlos sagt, dass das eben genau der Punkt ist, dass es bei Vertrauen nicht darum geht, mit Expertenwissen anzukommen, sondern dass man bei kleinen Events, bei Dorffesten oder so auftaucht und da ist und eben eine Beziehung zu den Community Members, Gemeindemitgliedern aufbaut. Danke.
Okay, I have a question because now I do not want to neglect all the resistance.
Okay.
So that was very strong, even if I was reputed. So people sent my daily newspaper to the concentration camp of Dachau. They vandalized my house, about 10,000 euro damage, and. So I don't want to put that under the carpet.
Ja, also Christoph hebt nur mal vor, dass es jetzt nicht so ist, dass er jetzt nur einfach ein geachteter Teil der Gemeinde war, sondern dass er durchaus sehr viel Widerstand erfahren hat, dass seine Zeitschrift, seine Zeitung nach Dachau geschickt, weitergeleitet wurde, dass sein Haus von Vandalismus betroffen hat, 10.000 Euro Schaden. Also es ist nicht so, und er will das nicht unter den Teppich gehen, es ist nicht so, dass das alles easy peasy.
That was the time of the NPD and Republicans you talked about yesterday. Now, concerning your work, which role did money, envy, and greed play? Because you have, how do you call that? Greenwood.
Rising.
What? Yes.
Rising.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Which role did that play? The very low human mankind greed.
Don't make me tell the truth,
Tell the
Christoph.
truth.
Don't make me tell the truth.
I
No,
trust you. I
no.
trust you.
Sorry, kannst du vielleicht einfach ganz kurz die Frage nochmal auf Deutsch sagen?
Also es geht darum, welche Rolle spielt bei dem Tulsa Massaker der ganz normale, die niederen Instinkte des Menschen, nämlich der Wettstreit, einen Competitor jetzt loszuwerden, oder der Geiz oder die Gier nach des Nachbarn Besitz.
Okay, thank you.
I'm stalling because I'm really trying to figure out how to be vulnerable right now, and not be defensive about that question. But I certainly the most explosive issue. So there was resistance to some of the work that you were doing, and there was vandalism. There was no sort of violence in that way, but there was a lot of just unproductive discourse and conversation around Greenwood Rising. It cost $30 million to create Greenwood Rising.
Also er hat jetzt nicht so einen Widerstand erfahren im Sinne mit Vandalismus wie Christoph, aber gerade in der Diskussion um dieses Greenwood Rising, also das Monument, gab es einfach sehr viel, sehr unnötige Diskussionen, und es waren 30 Millionen Euro Projekt. Dollar.
$30 million. And the commission raises $30 million in short order, about 3.5 years. The whole time that money is being raised, it's clear that it's being raised to create Greenwood Rising, to tell the story, a victim, survivor, descendant centered story. That's what the money is for.
Awesome.
Ja, genau. Also über die ganze Zeit, wo das Geld eingetrieben wurde, war klar, das geht darum, ein Mahnmal, Denkmal zu schaffen für die Opfer, die Überlebenden, die Nachfahren dieser Gewalttaten.
But as we get closer to the 100th anniversary, there is discussion within the community about how that $30 million is being used. Ultimately, many in the community believed that the $30 million that had been raised should go directly to survivors and not to the building of a museum.
Ja, und über die Zeit, also genau, war dann eben die Diskussion groß, was passiert mit diesem Geld, und da wurden dann vor allem auch Stimmen lauter, die gesagt haben, das Geld soll direkt an die Nachfahren und an die Überlebenden gehen und nicht an dieses Denkmal.
And we have to remember that this attack, this unprecedented attack on the black community never received reparations. It's estimated that Greenwood, that $600 million in property value was lost as a result of the massacre, right? And so imagine $600 million in today's dollars, what was liquidated. And so, sorry, thank you, Mark. Appreciate you,
so
Mark.
important what you're saying. You don't want anything to be lost.
Genau, und da wieder muss man verstehen, dass in Greenwood es gab nie Entschädigungen. Also es wurden nie die Opfer entschädigt. Und der Schaden, der durch die Zerstörung an den Race Massacre entstanden ist, lag bei $600 Millionen, was genau heute deutlich mehr wäre. Das heißt, man muss sich diese Relation eben vorstellen, dass Menschen $600 Millionen verloren haben.
So you have this historic debt owed to the community, and in the midst of all of that, you have three living survivors who were centenarians, who are living in poverty. And the community is saying that $30 million should go to them because the community and survivors directly have never received anything.
Ja. Und dann eben in dieser Diskussion um dieses Greenwood Rising hat man dann 3 Überlebende sitzen, die in Armut leben und die nie dafür entschädigt wurden, für das, was ihnen angetan wurde. Und dann sagt die Community, oder dann sagt die Gemeinde, diese $30 Millionen sollen an diese Menschen gehen.
And the conundrum for stuff is that Greenwood Rising and the $30 million raised by the commission could never take the place of a historic reparations program, a $600 million reparations program that was owed the city. It was as if the commission was being asked to build a museum and honor, as well as provide reparations for victims and survivors, which is the role of the city that was responsible for the commission.
Ja. Was sozusagen dann die Schlussfolgerung am Ende war das sorry, I didn't get what kind of commission that was.
Just the Tulsa Race Massacre Commemorative Commission.
Okay, es gab so eine Kommission, die sich eben um dieses Race Massacre gekümmert hat, und die haben diese 30 Millionen aufgetrieben, und dann am Ende war eben klar, das kann nicht sein, dass die jetzt dafür verantwortlich sind, die Entschädigungen zu zahlen. Das ist Stadtsache. Und das war sozusagen dann die Erkenntnis, die man haben kann, dass diese Kommission, die sich zusammengefunden hat, nicht dafür verantwortlich sein kann, zum einen den Gedenkort zu schaffen und zum anderen auch noch für die Entschädigungszahlungen aufzukommen.
So do you understand now why I asked about the money? Because money played a very important role in Germany after the Second World War. So the Jews who came back to the very small villages where they had lived. And I have these lists illegally now. I have these lists, and I have the proof who profited from the deportation, emigration, or the death of the Jews. And especially in these villages where everybody knows everybody else, the resistance against reparations and memory work was the strongest. And just one example, so there is a very small village, about 1,000 people. They had a referendum 4 or 5 years ago, and all the people of the village were asked, do you want to lay Stolpersteine? And the majority of this village was against that. I think it is unique in Germany. The TV stations all send programs about that, and the mayor can say now they don't want the people of Gemünden, that's town, the city, they don't want Stolpersteine, so leave it like it is. And then I of course, I can tell them who profited from the deportation of the Jews. And they are the same families who lived 2 or 3 generations ago.
Okay, ich werde das vielleicht ein bisschen abkürzen. Er fragt, Christoph hat nach dem Thema Geld, also er hat ja nach diesen Habsucht oder welche niederen Instinkte, und hat das Thema Geld sozusagen eben gefragt, weil das auch in der deutschen Erinnerungsarbeit eine große Rolle gespielt hat. Durch seine illegalen Kopiertätigkeiten hat er Listen gefunden, Listen gehabt, wo man genau nachvollziehen konnte, wer hat eigentlich von der Deportation, von der Verfolgung und von der Vertreibung der Juden und Jüdinnen profitiert in den Dörfern. Und das konnte man nachvollziehen. Und er sagt, dass eben gerade in diesen kleineren Dörfern das Thema Entschädigungszahlungen sehr oft eben abgelehnt wird. Und er hat ein Beispiel jetzt auch genannt von einem Dorf, das war auch überall in den Medien, wo tatsächlich die Dorfbevölkerung sich dagegen entschieden hat, Stolpersteine auszulegen. Also, I think we should soon also, because I think now we have heard both perspectives, which I think is great because this is why we're here, right? But I really would like to also give the audience a chance to share something or to have a question. So I would love to, if that's okay with you, to open this up now to everyone else and have like 2 or 3 comments and questions to this conversation. Ich sage jetzt nur, dass wir das jetzt auch nochmal, also dass wir jetzt ja viel gehört haben und dass eben gerade dieser Austausch jetzt schon stattgefunden hat und dass ich das gerne jetzt nochmal öffnen würde auch an euch für Kommentare oder Fragen, genau, falls jemand was hat. Ansonsten führen wir das Gespräch einfach weiter, aber ich dachte, ich gebe das einmal kurz hier rein. Does anybody want to share something or have a question? Alex, you look like you.
Yeah, I have a question for Karlos. Do you have the feeling that the healing process between the 2 communities is starting? Yeah, that it's starting to heal already? No. Okay. Because with the aim of the healing process, I had the whole time in mind. Yeah, is it working? Is it working now? It needs time. Healing needs time. But yeah.
No.
So I will translate his question. Alex' Frage war, Karlos spricht ja viel davon, dass dass diese ganze Arbeit um Heilung und um Versöhnung geht. Und Alex' Frage war jetzt, wie ist es denn? Gab es schon einen Heilungsprozess in diesen Communities? Und der Teaser ist das wahrscheinlich nicht, weil Karlos hat schon mal ein bisschen No gesagt.
I just want to stand, because my leg is stiff right now, but there's so much anger, disappointment, disillusionment around what did not happen as a result of the 100th anniversary that there just isn't any will to heal right now.
Also es ist einfach so viel Enttäuschung und Desillusion in der schwarzen Community in Greenwood bezüglich dieses 100-jährigen Jubiläums, dass da keine Bereitschaft gerade da ist.
You have to remember that for 100 years this story had mostly not been remembered. And all of a sudden it was, and people's hopes raised for what might happen. The President of the United States came to Tulsa on June 1st and said almost to the word that it was a massacre. And nothing happened.
Also man muss eben verstehen, für fast 100 Jahre wurde diese Geschichte einfach nicht erinnert. Und dann plötzlich war es eben soweit, dass die Geschichte besprochen wurde und dass sie an die Öffentlichkeit kam. Das heißt aber, dass die Hoffnungen natürlich auch gestiegen sind und genau, eben bezüglich Entschädigung und so weiter. Und dass eben sogar der US-Präsident dort vor Ort kam und fast wortwörtlich beschrieben hat, dass es ein Massaker war.
And just finally, and so with raised expectations, President of the United States coming, there was this raised sense of hope and expectation, and nothing seemingly changed, but you had left a Greenwood Rising. And so quite naturally, I think, because there was raised hopes and all the community felt like it was Greenwood Rising, when what was old was so great, you can see where there's a lot of disillusionment, disappointment, and rage. And right now, because that's so palpable, I mean, I feel it. I was in Greenwood just before I came here, talking to descendants about Greenwood Rising, and having the hardest conversations. People are just not in a place to heal right now. So.
Also sagt, dass eben mit diesen gesteigerten, also mit diesen höheren Erwartungen und Hoffnungen war dann die Enttäuschung groß, dass alles, was dann am Ende dabei rausgekommen ist, dieses Greenwood Rising, also dieses Denkmal war. Und dass die Enttäuschung einfach so tief sitzt, dass gerade im Moment da kein Heilungsprozess möglich ist. Er weiß, kurz bevor er hierher gekommen ist, hat er sich noch auch mit Nachfahren getroffen und da kann gerade im Moment kein Heilungsprozess stattfinden. So we have many questions. I hope that answered your question. Mark, you had a question early on.
Yeah, so if we bridge last night's conversation to today, and Derek was talking, and Connie, about the political climate, which is different in Germany than the United States.
Danke. Also wenn wir jetzt nochmal auch vergleichen von gestern Abend zu heute und wir das politische Klima uns anschauen, das ja eben sehr anders ist in Deutschland und in den USA.
So I guess the question is, how much of the political climate, the rise of white nationalism in the United States in a dramatic way, is sort of impacting, and states legislating, not teaching about the history of racism. How much is that, did that work in your community? I mean, how was that in play? And then for you to reflect on how things in your community has changed as the sort of the political climate has changed in a positive way, possibly, in terms of what memory work can look like.
Okay. Die Frage von Marc ist, wenn wir uns eben jetzt an dieses politische Klima angucken, dann mal die Frage an Karlos, inwiefern in den letzten Jahren der Anstieg eben also der massive Anstieg von rechtspopulistischen Ideologien in seiner Arbeit bemerkbar ist und wie die beeinflusst wurde, und eben sozusagen die ähnliche Frage an Christoph, wie politischer Wandel, in welche Richtung auch immer er ihn erlebt hat, sich auf die Erinnerungsarbeit in seiner Region ausgewirkt hat. Danke. Karlos, maybe you can.
Sure. The political climate really shaped everything about the work that we did. I should start with the founder of the Centennial Commission was a senator, an Oklahoma senator, Senator Matthews.
Also das politische Klima hat sich total auf seine Arbeit ausgewirkt. Sorry, can you say that?
Senator, just the Oklahoma senator, was the chair, the founder of the Centennial Commission.
Diese Kommission, die gegründet wurde, die wurde von einem Senator, I
just Senator Matthews, but
Senator Matthews gegründet.
so many of the individuals on the commission were political. The governor of the state, the mayor of Tulsa, members of the city council, and then Karlos Hill.
Also in dieser Kommission saßen sehr viele, die aus der Politik kamen, Stadtrat, Bürgermeister und andere und Karlos.
And just finally, Mark, to underscore this, the most painful part, I think, for Senator Matthews, who's a politician, was having to kick off the commission, the governor of Oklahoma, as well as U.S. Senator James Lankford. Or actually, Lankford volunteered himself off, but he was initially asked to leave, and he did not want to go.
Just give
But
a
why-
little bit of
why
a
do they
hint
want
to
to
the
leave?
Germans here,
Which part?
what these people you're talking about represent. What does that governor represent right
Yes,
now?
it's maybe too complicated to try to explain it that way. I just wanted to make sure you understood that the individuals on this Centennial Commission, many of them were politicians weighing how the commission was doing based on public sentiment. And so the political climate really mattered and really informed what we were doing.
Just one question: were they Republicans or Democrats?
It was Republicans, Democrats, social justice folk like me. It was a range of and it wasn't just politicians, it was descendants. Initially it had been survivors. There was a range of, it was about 40 individuals. It was a range of individuals, but certainly there were politicians, and that impacted what we did.
Also das ist so ein bisschen komplex, weil US-amerikanische Politik, aber was die Kernaussage ist bei Karlos, dass die Politik dieses Projekt auf jeden Fall beeinflusst hat, weil eben in dieser Kommission so viele Leute aus der Politik saßen, sowohl von den Republikanern als auch von den Demokraten. Dann mussten welche gehen. Das ist so ein bisschen komplex, und da waren natürlich dann aber auch Nachfahren und Überlebende. Und deswegen wurde aber diese ganze Kommission, dieses ganze Projekt sehr geprägt davon, welche politischen Stimmungen gerade so zur Debatte sind. Christoph, maybe?
Yes, to your question, has anything changed? So, you know that the Hollywood series Holocaust, I think in Germany it was shown in 1979, and from that onwards, a lot has changed in Germany. Not only about the Stolpersteine, but also the memory work. And the basis, as I said at the beginning, was the truth. So because the prejudice and all the bias, they have disappeared. That Jews were rich and could flee early enough. That disappeared. So, and we are working in our region. I do not want to talk now about 20% of the Germans who have anti-Semitic feelings until today, what he said yesterday. So we deal with the younger generation. So, and there is a big change. So especially the churches, and especially the Protestant church, they come to us with their groups, with their religious groups, and even older people, older women and men, they come to us and they want to hear the truth. And even a professor of a university in Koblenz, he said 2 years ago, oh, sorry. Muss lauter.
Ja.
Ja, Christoph, Sie können doch selber sagen in Deutsch, man muss Sie noch nicht übersetzen.
Ja, aber manchmal ist es angenehmer.
Ja, dann versteht ihr das nicht.
Nein, das muss einfach nochmal selber auf Deutsch sagen.
Ja, ich kann das dann auch.
Ja, dann sag doch selber.
Ja, ich kann jetzt nur über die Region Hunsrück sprechen. Und seit dieser Zeit, als wir eben die Fakten auf den Tisch gelegt haben, dass Juden nicht reich sind und dass sie fliehen konnten und dass wir haben jetzt letztes Jahr herausgefunden, 338 alleine in diesem sehr kleinen Kreis, 100.000 Einwohner heute, dass die ermordet wurden in ganz verschiedenen Lagern überall in Europa. So, und seit dieser Zeit besuchen uns eben auch die kirchlichen Gruppen, Firmlinge und Konfirmanden und ältere Leute kommen zu uns und wollen eben wissen, wie es hier war. Natürlich, ihre Erinnerung ist eine ganz spezielle, aber seitdem hat sich da sehr viel bewegt und da wir eben Tausende von Schülern erreichen, haben wir das, was in Dübeln passiert, haben wir bei uns nicht. Da kann ich jetzt sagen, das sind wir schuld, aber so vermessen bin ich nicht. Aber wir haben die AfD bei 3–4%. In manchen Dörfern, wo 60–70% russischstämmige Aussiedler wohnen, da ist die AfD bei 20%. Da kann man jetzt lange drüber nachdenken. Und auch jetzt irgendwelche großen Attacken oder auf mich oder anderen. Natürlich, ich bin der Oberjude, obwohl ich gar kein Jude bin. Aber so geht das. Solche Dinge kann man...
War das jetzt die Übersetzung von dem?
Das war,
du bist ein bisschen, glaube ich,
das war
weitergegangen.
fast die Übersetzung.
He almost translated what he said. But
So,
it
a
is
lot
already-
has changed, yes.
I really want to ask a question
Yeah.
that, because I want to pick on these students at the front. I told them I was going to pick on them, Eunice and Eva. And I want to pick on them because yesterday we were able to see the work that they've done and the ways in which their master teacher has empowered them through, Holocaust remembrance work. And so could you talk about sort of what it means for you to do this work, and at the center of doing that work is empowering students, former students, but in the past bringing students together to sort of do remembrance work. What does that mean for you?
Also Karlos greift gerade auf, dass gestern das Visiting Program hat mit Savitz ehemaligen und aktuellen SchülerInnen deren Arbeit gesehen. Und aufgrund dessen fragt er jetzt Christoph, was das für ihn bedeutet, diese Erinnerungsarbeit mit jungen Menschen zu machen.
So this is the main focus. So I just talked 20 minutes ago about the beginning, but it has lasted now 40 years. And if I look at my region, nearly every bigger city where Jews lived, they have stumbling blocks, Stolpersteine, or a memorial, or anything like that. And the second, what you mentioned at the beginning, the work with the descendants. So the reconciliation really worked with the second or third generation.
Okay.
They come to us, okay?
Also diese Arbeit mit jungen Menschen ist der Kern seiner Arbeit und das war der Anfang. Und dann hat er das 40 Jahre, macht das jetzt seit 40 Jahren und inzwischen gibt es wirklich eigentlich in jeder kleinen Stadt die Stolpersteine und es ist präsent. Und die Arbeit mit Nachfahren, sorry, da habe ich dich unterbrochen. Und die Arbeit mit Nachfahren.
So, and they send us, every year I get emails from all over the world because we have a family archive. And they want to know, for example, where is my great-great mother buried? So normally we can give them an answer. So, and that has made the relationship between the descendants concerning reconciliation very, very close. And the second is we go with one school every year to Auschwitz for 4 or 5 days. We have established a German, Israeli, Palestinian, very difficult, youth exchange. And it has been going on for 22 years and still Corona came. So, and that has empowered the people to stand up against racism, anti-Semitism and all the other isms we have.
Also diese Arbeit eben mit den Nachfahren, auch mit Jugendlichen und mit den Jugendlichen aber auch fahren sie mit einer Schule zum Beispiel seit 20 Jahren für wirklich mehrere Tage nach Auschwitz und arbeiten da auch zum Austauschprojekt zwischen
Ja, das ist der offizielle deutsch-israelische Austausch.
Ja.
Und wenn man dann Palästina mit dazu nimmt, dann gibt es Probleme.
Genau.
Nicht von den Palästinensern, das muss ich sagen.
Genau, und dass aber sozusagen diese Arbeit eben den jungen Menschen auch ermöglicht, sich gegen Rassismus und andere Formen von Diskriminierung hinzustellen und ja, dagegen aufzustehen. So, jetzt haben wir, okay, now I think we have these two more questions, and then I would like to open up the space to also hear from the workshops before, because not everybody has been at Karlen's workshop and not everybody has been at Steve's workshop. So I would love to have these two questions and then kind of wrap up the morning. Okay? So, Sabit, bitte.
Es ist ehrlich gesagt keine Frage, sondern eher ein bisschen Widerspruch. Also ich finde, dass du nicht ganz, also du nur einen Teil der Gesellschaft im Moment darstellst, was den Antisemitismus anbelangt. Ich gebe dir recht, dass es diese, übersetzt erstmal, sonst ist es...
Yeah. So Sabe doesn't want to ask something, but she
It's not a
she wants to
question.
object to some parts of what Christoph has said, because how he only represents part of our society today. The way he displayed the topic of described anti-Semitism in our society.
Also natürlich ist es richtig, dass es sich viel entwickelt hat und sich verändert hat, dass es eben von Stolpersteinen bis hin zu große Gruppen, die Interesse an dem Thema haben, aber gleichzeitig gibt es einen steigenden Antisemitismus. Ne? Es gab noch nie so viel antisemitische Übergriffe wie in den letzten Jahren. Es gibt viele Menschen, die sich überhaupt nicht dafür interessieren, ob da irgendwelche Stolpersteine liegen. Es gibt Angriffe auf Gedenkorte. Ich war gerade mit einer Schülergruppe in Niedersachsen, wir haben 5 Gedenkstätten besucht und alle 5 haben erzählt von massiven Angriffen auf ihre Museen. Also und da finde ich, das darf man nicht vergessen.
She wants to make sure. No, sorry, I need to translate.
Just one remark and then the discussion is over.
No, but I need to translate that. I need to translate it because it's actually very important. You realize now we're getting to discussion. So Sabit says that what we also need to acknowledge is that there is a tremendous rise of anti-Semitism in Germany. That of course a lot has happened and there are a lot of stumbling stones, but there's also a rise of anti-Semitism. There have never been more anti-Semitic attacks, or in the last year as
Before.
there have been more in the last year than in recent years before, and also memorial sites are experience vandalism. She just a few days ago she went to a memorial site with a group, and everywhere you go they tell you that they experienced this, and this is also part of remembrance work in Germany and in the society. And I'm sure that Christoph didn't want to leave that out, so you can give your remark.
Ich habe zweimal gesagt, ich spreche nur für die Region, flaches Land, wo wir einen großen Einfluss haben, wo wir keine antisemitischen Straftaten in dem Sinne, wie du die genannt hast, haben. Ich kann es nur nochmal wiederholen.
So what he
Also
says is that
für diese Region.
yeah.
Das sieht anders aus. Wir sagen bei der Landesregierung in Rheinland-Pfalz, ihr müsst die Erinnerungsarbeit regionalisieren. Und wir haben in Rheinland-Pfalz nur 2 KZs und da geht es nur um diese furchtbare Geschichte des Holocaust. Es geht nicht um das jüdische Leben bei denen. Und deshalb sagen wir denen, ihr müsst die Erinnerungskultur auf neue Beine stellen.
So what he says is that he was really talking about this specific region that he is working in, which is a rather rural area. And in this region, there weren't anti-Semitic attacks or vandalism.
Okay,
And that's the
wow.
only...
I live there too.
So we have, so now we...
Do you agree?
Okay. Facilitating and translating sometimes. I think we should hear Gabi because she lives in that. No, you
Yeah,
don't.
I live in the same area, but I only wanted to say that when we had the memorial service in 2019 in Eich. Da habe ich ja schon
Eich.
in Eich, ja. We had to hire police to stand outside. So, and not because we really thought somebody would do something, but just the fact that we had to get police there because Halle just happened. And one of our speakers was too afraid to speak because just a week before somebody had thrown a stone through his window because they knew that they were speaking at our event. So
Also-
it's kind of hidden, you don't see it in the newspapers, but the local people know it.
Also Gabi ist ja auch im ländlichen Raum tätig und sie sagt, sie hatten eine Gedenkveranstaltung geplant und mussten dafür Polizei einstellen. Das war kurz nach Halle, und das war sozusagen vorbeugend, aber einer der Vortragenden hat sich nicht getraut zu kommen, weil ein paar Tage davor ihm ein Stein durchs Fenster geworfen wurde, weil die Leute auch wussten, dass er da sprechen wird. Das heißt, genau, einfach, das ist manchmal nicht ganz so offensichtlich und manchmal steht es auch nicht in der Zeitung, aber das gibt es und es gibt es auch eben im ländlichen Raum. Okay, Andreas.
Ja, ich wollte noch mal das Thema aufgreifen, wie man mit den Jugendlichen arbeitet. Also gerade die Jugend ist ja das, wo vielleicht der Heilungsprozess passieren kann.
He just wanted to talk about the topic of working with youth, because the youth might be the people that you can work on reconciliation and start this healing process.
Absolutely.
War da noch eine konkrete Frage? Oder?
Nein, ich wollte noch was dazu sagen.
Okay, he wanted to say something in addition to that.
Also ich komme ja aus Halle und wir haben dieses Projekt, was wir machen, vor 10 Jahren schon angefangen und zwischendurch ist ja dieses Attentat passiert. Also es passiert immer wieder. Aber eine gute Methode bei uns ist, dass wir die Jugendlichen kommunal recherchieren lassen und sie mit ihrem Wissen dann an die Öffentlichkeit treten und auch an die älteren Bürger, die eigentlich von dem, was passiert ist, gar nichts wissen, weil es gab ja bei uns keine jüdische Gemeinschaft. Ja? Und da gibt es die Älteren, die dann sagen, aha, weil es ist ja Antisemitismus immer noch weiter passiert, auch in Ostdeutschland, aber es wusste keiner. Ja?
So working with youth, and he lives in Halle, and Halle is the place that was referred to, where a few years ago there was an attack on a synagogue, and that was like one of the most clear outbreaks of anti-Semitism in Germany. And he says that one method that works pretty well when working with his students is to have them research local history, write it down, and then bring it back to the community and bring it back to the older generation as well. Because they, as he also said this morning, they don't know about Jewish history and the past. And so bringing the students to educate the older generation is a good method for this whole process that we started. Yeah, so maybe you can just give a comment on that.
I enthusiastically agree with everything you said, and I will second it. Can I tell a story? Do we have time to tell a story? Just a short story.
Yeah, okay.
Short
A
story.
short story.
But
Also er stimmt hier mit einem zu, und zwar enthusiastisch, und er möchte uns eine kleine Geschichte erzählen.
in the spirit of enthusiastic approval, the 1958 sit-in Oklahoma City. So I live in Oklahoma City, and I want to tell you just a tiny bit about it. In 1958, 13 students initiated, and students ages 7 to 13, they initiated a sit-in movement in downtown Oklahoma City in 1958 that led to the national sit-in movement in America.
Im Jahr 1958 gab es eine Sitzblockade von SchülerInnen zwischen 7 und 13 Jahren alt die angefangen haben in Oklahoma City mit dieser Sitzblockade. Und das war tatsächlich der Ausgangspunkt für die nationalweite, landesweite Bewegung.
And so, youth, as Clara Luper, who supported the students in organizing sit-ins of Oklahoma City, she believed that youth were the engine of change. She said she believed change would not happen unless youth did it. And that's why she convinced 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13-year-olds, 13 of them to go downtown and to protest segregation.
Ja. Also die Organisatorin dieser Sitzblockade war eben der Überzeugung, dass die Jugend die treibende Kraft für Veränderung überhaupt ist. Und deswegen ist sie hingegangen, hat diese 13 SchülerInnen zwischen 7 und 13 Jahren ermutigt, sich diese Demonstration zu machen.
And just last thing, Clara Luper, I mentioned her as a master teacher. She used the sit-ins as a form of protest, as a way of teaching students what democratic citizenship looked like. And so the sit-in movement became Freedom's Classroom. And so, but again, it was about, she believes students are the engine. There's nothing else, it's students, it's youth who drive social change, and that's why she elevated them and empowered them to basically end segregation, to stimulate a sit-in movement nationally and end segregation in Oklahoma well before it ended in the rest of the country.
Ja, also ich habe den Namen vergessen, aber diese Lehrerin war eben sehr, sehr engagiert darin, diese Proteste aufzubauen und hat das als sozusagen Ausleben einer demokratischen Bürgerschaft gesehen und eben als einen Weg, dass Jugend eben wirklich Veränderungen mitbringen kann und damit eben in der Teil der Segregation sozusagen hat sie damit diese ganze Bewegung massiv angetrieben.
And my last thing, my greatest joy is that I get to spend time with them. I'm writing about them, and so I spend hours just sitting with them, hearing them talk about how much they love their teacher, Clara Luper, who helped them to protest, and just how much she means and how they still are activated in serving their community because of what they learned from their teachers. So it really does matter. I just wanted to enthusiastically say yes. That's something that I really take seriously and certainly put at the center of what we do in Oklahoma City.
Also der Teil der Arbeit macht ihm auch super viel Spaß, weil er unterhält sich eben mit diesen damaligen Schülern viel, die ihm erzählen, wie viel ihnen auch diese Lehrerin bedeutet hat, dass sie ermutigt hat. Und schlussendlich wollte er einfach nur sagen, dass Arbeit mit Jugendlichen und dieses Ermutigen, dass sie selber aktiv werden und rausgehen in die Gesellschaft, ist was unglaublich wichtig ist und es ist auch ein Kernteil seiner Arbeit. Okay, thank you. It's such a bummer to, at some point, we have to stop this conversation at some point, because I think we could go on for hours and there would be so many interesting aspects that we could still dive into. Es ist wirklich ein Jammer, dass wir irgendwann aufhören müssen, miteinander zu reden, weil es gibt einfach viel zu viel, über das man sprechen kann. Wir haben jetzt noch ungefähr 20 Minuten bis zum Mittagessen. We have about 20 minutes before you guys leave to Saxony. I would love to, or more, let's make it 15, because there's always, we have 15 minutes, and I would love to hear from someone, like from some of you guys, what you took away from the workshops or the sessions that you were in today, because I think we have had a lot of input. and I would just love to hear like a few highlights, and I hope that we can get a highlight from every one of the three, just to get a sense of what we've heard and what we've learned today. Ich frage nach, dass wir von jedem der Veranstaltungen ein bisschen was hören, was am herausragendsten, was hängen geblieben ist. Und Alex, I thought you, did I see your hand raised?
Aber ich kann gerne was sagen. I can,
Oh no, if you like, we can also just maybe someone else.
and someone else wants?
Ja, Michael.
Ja, also ich bin vor allen Dingen dankbar, dass wir den Blick nach Amerika öffnen konnten. Ich habe dort sehr viel erfahren, also das über Tulsa, das wusste ich nicht, ich habe das erst gelesen in der Vorbereitung, über die Materialien, die uns zugeschickt wurden. Ich kannte das so nicht und das hat mich doch sehr bewegt. Und jetzt jemanden zu erleben, der sich mit diesem Thema auseinandersetzt, das finde ich ganz, ganz wichtig. Überhaupt, dass wir diesen Kontakt auch in den digitalen Stammtischen manchmal mit amerikanischen Erfahrungen teilen können. Das ist also für mich auch eine sehr interessante und auch sehr bewegende Erfahrung. Das ist das eine. Und das andere ist, was Christoph erzählte, dass ich solche Erfahrungen auch gemacht habe und wir auch ähnliche Experimente gemacht haben. Das ist der falsche.
Illegal.
Ja, so ein bisschen. Und es uns dann dadurch gelungen ist, Zahlen und Namen aus dem Archiv mitzubringen. Und die haben wir dann auch skrupellos veröffentlicht, ohne jetzt nochmal auf die Fragen der Urheber, also der rechtlichen Dinge, da besonders Wert zu legen. Und das war schon interessant.
So Michael says that he's very grateful to have this opportunity to get the perspectives from the US, because that is something, and he mentioned that he said that he didn't know about the Tulsa Race Massacre before. I've sent the papers around and he could read about it, and now meeting you and hearing from your work on this matter is super enriching, and he's very grateful that he was able to be part of this. And then he referred to Christoph and said that they also did illegal copying and publishing work with documents and with numbers that nobody wanted to know about in his past. So there's a shared experience there. Thank you, Michael. Danke. Does anybody else want to share? Yeah?
Ich möchte Michael vollends zustimmen. Ich habe das auch mit Tulsa erst erfahren, durch die Vorbereitung und so weiter. Und jemanden so enthusiastisch zu erleben, das stärkt wieder die eigene Energie. Und ein Wort, das ist mir jetzt ganz wichtig geworden, was ich für meine Arbeit verwenden will, das ist das heilende Moment. Und ich denke, das hat vielleicht wahrscheinlich schon jeder von uns erfahren, egal mit welcher Altersgruppe er arbeitet. Der Raum des Gespräches muss sich genau in diese Richtung öffnen. Dann ist die Chance noch größer, dass man etwas bewegen kann.
So she, very nice words. So she also said that she wants to agree with Michael, that also she didn't know about Tulsa and is very grateful. She also referred to having someone speak so enthusiastically is something that gives, that encourages her to keep on going with her work. So it is this encouraging moment, and that the word that she takes away from this conversation the most is this notion of healing. And that she says that probably everyone doing this work has experienced this in some way, but really this should be the goal, to create spaces and where healing can take place, and that this is what it's about, and that this is what she takes home with her. Danke, Hospitation. Ja, Andreas?
Ich möchte nur ganz kurz noch was sagen. Ich hatte mich ja auch vorbereitet und den Text gelesen. Und ich habe dort eine Textstelle gelesen, die ich gut nachempfinden konnte. Ich bin müde geworden. Und das finde ich sehr gut, denn das macht uns Menschen auch aus, dass wir ein Gefühl ausdrücken, dass wir nur durch gemeinsam vielleicht wieder Kraft geben. Und ich wünsche ihm ganz viel Kraft.
He says that he prepared for this by reading the article, and there was one line that really resonated with him. That was, "I'm tired," or "I was tired." I don't know exactly, and he could really feel that. And this is something that also happens to people, and he just really wishes you power and strength, and that you can keep on doing this great work.
I'm gonna have to come and shake your hand.
Er wird
I'm
deine
gonna
Hand
have to
gleich
get
nehmen.
up out the seat
Er wird dir die Hand
and come and shake your hand. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Ja, Brunhilde.
Ja, ich wollte auch noch was sagen. Also ich bin seit 52 Jahren mit der jüdischen Forschung aus unserem Dorf beschäftigt. Und mir wurde überall geholfen. Also bei der Behörde, auf den Ämtern, im Archiv, mir wurde überall geholfen. Ich bin auch nicht angegriffen worden, nie. Ich konnte bei die Leute gehen im Dorf und alle waren bereitwillig und haben dir von ihren Nachbarn erzählt und so. Und ich habe dann auch mal erfahren, dass man, als ich zur Kirche ging, die Männer da standen und einer sagte dann, da kommt die Frau Synagoge. Und das habe ich als Lehrer empfunden.
Brunhilde just wants to share that, because we have talked about resistance and so on, that actually she in her community has never experienced resistance. She was supported by the city council, by local authorities, and wherever she went, also in the community, people helped her. And one time she went to church and there were men standing outside and they were talking, and then they said, "Oh, there comes Mrs. Synagogue." And to her, that was a great honor, and she felt honored. So that's another experience. I would love to hear one or two. I would love to hear what happened, what you heard in the workshops before this session. So maybe. The thing is that they have to leave in about 5 minutes. After, you can say it to him after. I'm really sorry, I have to be strict right now. I don't like this, but I want to hear Carmen, if you want to say something about it.
Ja, dann danke vielleicht bis zu unserem Workshop sozusagen davor. Also ich habe bei Karlos dankenswerterweise teilnehmen dürfen. Wir haben über digitale Medien gesprochen. Das ist jetzt ein bisschen ein harter Cut. Ich glaube deswegen, weil es so, also ich fand es sehr, sehr gut, weil es sehr praktisch angelegt war. Jetzt haben wir so eine inspirierende Geschichte gehört, da fällt es zum Beispiel so ein bisschen schwer, darüber zu sprechen. Aber ich fand es super, dass es so praktisch angelegt war, weil viele von uns arbeiten auf ganz unterschiedlichen Leveln mit digitalen Medien, und ich glaube, wir haben hinterher noch so viel gesprochen, aber wir haben so einen Glinz, ein Lichtlein bekommen, wie es aussehen könnte, wenn wir denn manchmal professioneller, vor allem manchmal besser gefördert wären. Aber es war einfach, um das nochmal zu sagen, wirklich unfassbar, was für eine großartige App da entsteht, und ich bin einfach nur neidisch, weil ich sie haben möchte.
Yeah. Okay, so this might seem like a hard cut because the workshop that Karin was giving was very practical and technical, and now we've heard such an inspiring story, but this work often is practical and it needs to be practical, so it was super important to talk about digital media and how you could use them in order to tell these stories of the past. And Carmen said that it gave them a glimpse of what could be there in the future if only there was enough financial support, because they looked at an app which is amazing, and we hope that in the future it will be affordable also on a local level. So I'm happy you enjoyed it. Ich freue mich, dass Sie das genossen haben. Nice. So, thank you so much. Then if anyone else wants to share something from, otherwise I would, Sabet.
Ich war in einem Workshop von Steven und ich fand das super, super spannend, weil ich sehr viele Parallelen gesehen habe. Also fand das spannend, wie Facing History eben mit den Communities arbeitet oder mit den Pädagogen, die in diesen Communities arbeiten. Ich habe nur gesagt, ich würde mir wünschen, dass Facing History mal einen Workshop für Lehrerinnen hier in Berlin veranstaltet, weil ich glaube, dass man da unheimlich viel voneinander lernen kann, weil wir eigentlich letztendlich eine ähnliche Arbeit machen.
Mm-hmm. So Sabit was was in Steve's workshop, and she said she found that super interesting, because she can relate her work to your work very well, and she thinks that facing history and ourselves is doing great work, and she just wishes that at some point there will be a teachers training in Berlin for Berlin teachers, because the challenges are that you face, or the kind of work you do, is very similar. So maybe we will we will see that in the future. First German, first English. So unfortunately we have to have this cut because people have to go. I hope that all of you can still think about this, process this, take some time to digest what you've heard, and keep the conversation going. The visiting program, people, you can do that in the following days, I hope. And the network, we have time this afternoon where we can talk more about what we've heard and how this affects us. So I really hope that this is not a too harsh ending to the session, even though I would have loved to keep this conversation going. Auf Deutsch nochmal ganz kurz. Es ist leider ein bisschen ein abruptes Ende, was einfach zeitlich nun mal so ist. Ich wünsche euch, dass ihr alles, das was ihr gehört habt, mit euch in euch tragt und reflektiert und auch vielleicht noch besprecht. Die Leute, die jetzt eben gehen müssen, die Visiting Program Leute, können das natürlich in den nächsten Tagen noch machen, und wir haben ja jetzt aber auch noch Zeit heute Nachmittag, um ein bisschen mehr zu reflektieren, um ein bisschen mehr zu gucken, was macht es eigentlich mit uns und wie sieht eigentlich unsere Arbeit gerade im Moment aus. And with these words, yes,
I have one
Joel?
final word, simple word. This has been a great event. I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank everybody who's organized and worked on making these things move smoothly. And I particularly want to thank you, Lily. You did a great job.